Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon and welcome to this pre-election public forum on international security, defence and trade, implications and priorities for New Zealand. My name's Todd Muller. I'm the Chairman of Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I'm also the Member of Parliament for Bay of Plenty. And one of the two out of the four that are here on time this afternoon. You may have picked up, but we live in interesting times in the New Zealand Parliament at the moment, and things are a little bit volatile, I guess, and so there are a couple of people who have delayed, the Honourable David Parker and Ron Mark. We have Barry Coates this evening representing the Green Party. Welcome, Barry. I look forward to hearing your comments shortly. This idea is the brainchild of Professor Rouben Azizian. I want to acknowledge him. He'll be Professor will be with you shortly to step through our experience this evening, which, depending on how many people turn up, may be at the more fluid end of the spectrum compared to the more defined end, which we thought was going to be the case. I just wanted to say just a few words as Chairman of Foreign Affairs and Trade around why this is such an important opportunity, really, for the four political parties here, National, obviously represented myself, Labour, Green and New Zealand First, to reflect on international defence, security and trade issues. To give you a sense of how immediate these issues are for the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committee. On Thursday when we next meet, on what will be actually our last meeting for the 51st Parliament, our committee will reflect on our final report on the NIA for the PACER Plus agreement, very much a trade focus. We will then follow that with a briefing on the major projects report from the Ministry of Defence in the context of the defence procurement that is underway and indeed in front of us. You can imagine the importance of actually stepping through in some detail with the leadership of the Ministry of Defence how well their procurement is going. And then we finish with a briefing on the negotiations for a nuclear weapon ban treaty. So it talks to the sorts of issues that Foreign Affairs Select Committee have to turn their mind to. It's a great privilege to chair that committee. It has a great mix of experience and, of course, the parties represented as mentioned earlier. I think it's the most collegial committee. I also sit on education and science. It is less collegial. But certainly Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, even though our individual and party perspectives might at times have a degree of difference. The respect that people hold each other's views in make it for a very enjoyable time. And I'm sure you would understand, as people interested in these topics, it is a fascinating time to be involved in reflecting on New Zealand's projection of its influence and interests in the global context. And so without any further ado, Professor, can I pass over to you to introduce at least two of our panel, and we hope that we'll be joined by the others shortly. Very good. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Todd, and I really want to thank the Select Committee for supporting this idea and initiative, which was conceived really last year through some meetings and discussions we had with Select Committee, the previous chair, Mark Mitchell, who is a successful defense minister. So Select Committee is not only known for being very organized and disciplined, but also propels people to higher seniority levels, and we wish all Select Committee members a very successful career in the future. And the idea was that there seems to be need for a better public awareness of security, defense, and trade issues. So a recent public poll was conducted by New Zealand Herald, and according to the poll, the economy is the number one concern or priority for most New Zealanders in terms of the pre-elections period and also generally speaking. It was followed by health and housing. Now, those of us who work full-time in security defense studies may feel a little like what's going on here. There's where is the security on this scale? And I think there could be 2 or 3 ways to interpret the poll, or definitely more. We have a large gathering of experts here. The one would be that perhaps New Zealanders feel that they live in a very safe, stable country. There's no need to worry about security or defense issues. And the North Korean missile, if it really reaches here, Australians will have to take care of it first, and we don't have to worry that much. The second other interpretation could be that, yeah, exactly, there is maybe some complacency and she'll be all right kind of attitude that, Kiwis don't really worry that much, because we have good, excellent relationship with all our, major partners, Australia, China, United States. Recent, trilateral exercise in Australia, the Talisman Sabre was, and some even referred to it as a revival of ANZUS type of thing. So why worry where we have so many reliable partners and friends? But then the third way to interpret would be that perhaps we still misperceive the concept of security and what security is. So because if you go back to economic concerns, what is an economic concern? If we don't look at the broader picture of economic issues, such as what happens to continued rise of China or decline of China for New Zealand economy. What happens if TPP doesn't take off? Is it going to affect economy or not? So there is a security aspect in that. There must be a security aspect in the health concern, because if we are worried about a drug addiction, and this has been publicly debated for the last few days, there is a strong security element in drug trafficking and crime. And even housing can be looked at in terms of human security or demographic security and migration. So as you can hear, I'm trying to securitize almost everything, and that's my job. So we oftentimes don't think of security in this broader context. We oftentimes delegate the responsibility and functions of security to select agencies and groups. And when we think security, we think sometimes a small group of agencies, rather than a broad public dialogue that includes government, politicians, businesses, NGOs, and others. And that is why we are a country, well, shall I say, most countries in the world have a national security strategy. We in New Zealand have a national security handbook. And to me, that in a way, this is no criticism of National Security Handbook, but I hope that we can step up into a broader conversation on security that includes not only very capable experts from DPMC and security agencies, but also the broader community. So having you here is a wonderful opportunity, and having a select committee and other members of parliament here hopefully will allow us to broaden this dialogue. So we have 3 speakers right now. We may have Ron Mark later on. We don't know yet. So I was going to introduce all 4, but I don't know if I introduce 4 and he doesn't show up. That's kind of a waste of time for this event. So maybe I will get started. Our first speaker will be Todd Muller, who is, of course, the chair of the Select Committee. And Todd has been in politics, but he has also been in business, and he has been involved with Fonterra and Zespri. But the best thing, if I may allow it, what I like about Todd is he's chair of the Select Committee on Defense and Foreign Affairs and Trade, but also of the education. And one other area where we need to do more and better is really develop a security studies education. And so having an educator amongst us and a security defense expert is wonderful. Todd will be followed by David, who represents the Labour Party, and David has had a distinguished political career and a government career. and he's the Shadow Attorney General. And the best highlight for me from David's background is that he's a rare example that you can be a Minister of Energy and climate change at the same time. In most contexts, that is a very antagonistic portfolios or relationships. And kudos to you, David, because you were also recognized as the environmentalist of the year by Listener. And for someone who does energy and climate change is a wonderful result. So, and we have Barry Coates with us, who represents the Green Party. And several people, when I heard that Barry Coates will be here, they said, oh, Barry, the Oxfam. And of course, as a former executive director of Oxfam, Barry, who is also the spokesperson for the Green Party on trade issues and internal affairs and other veteran senior issues, he's a great asset for us as well, as he will bring his international experience and his humanitarianist experience, working a long time on sustainability issues and Pacific issues. So we have a very complementary group of parliamentarians tonight. And so the procedure will be, I'm here to look nice, warm, and friendly, but also I have a role to manage this thing because some of our speakers will have to leave on time to do other things. But at the same time, we want to make sure and maximize opportunities for you to ask a question or make a comment. So we will invite all three, and then if Ron Mark shows up, he will be also introduced and invited. They will speak for 10 or so minutes. And after they have all spoken, we will open up for questions and answers, and there will be another protocol which I will announce in due course. If you have no objections and you support this important event, so thank you. And Todd, may I invite you here?
Hi, good evening. I would like to begin by setting the scene and discussing the context in which we operate. New Zealand is an active participant in the Asia-Pacific region, with our EEZ the fourth largest in the world, and with this large maritime domain comes significant responsibility and pressures. The New Zealand Defence Force must cover a search and rescue zone that stretches from the north of the equator all the way to the South Pole, halfway to Australia and halfway to South America. That's 11% of the planet. We're a maritime nation. 95% of our goods trade is by sea, linked to markets far from our shores here at the bottom corner of the globe. This is why we place significant importance on both the freedom of navigation, maintaining open trade lines, and having a stake in the maritime security and stability of the Asia-Pacific region. The South China Sea may be some distance from New Zealand, but over half of our trade transits this area. We therefore have a direct interest in how tensions are managed and miscalculations avoided. Wherever you look in our region, security, defence and trade are interrelated. New Zealand is also committed to a collective response outside our immediate region, and we recognise the interdependency between global threats and the security of our neighbourhood closer to home. Although we are often viewed as someone isolated from the rest of the world's troubles, the reality is that we face many of the same threats. The danger of nuclear proliferation is still present as North Korea continues to advance their missile training program. Violent extremism is ever present and a growing threat that reaches across the globe, whether this manifests as a complex network or lone wolf-style attacks by disenfranchised individuals. As ISIS loses territory in Syria and Iraq, we are also faced with the threat of returning terrorist fighters. We've also seen how harmful cyber attacks can be and what damage can be inflicted on civilian lives, infrastructure and economies. New Zealand, as a connected global citizen, is not immune to these threats. In 2001, Prime Minister Helen Clark described New Zealand as operating, and I quote, in an incredibly benign strategic environment. Today, this could not be further from the truth. New Zealand exists in an increasing, uncertain, unstable global world. While we do not face a direct military threat in the foreseeable future, the rules-based international order which New Zealand relies upon as a small country is under greater pressure. There are increasing tensions in the Asia-Pacific, an area where stability is critical for New Zealand's economic sustainability. Our partners in the South Pacific continue to face a range of economic, governance and environmental challenges. Activity in New Zealand's maritime domain is increasing, including in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, and incidents requiring a New Zealand response are becoming more likely to occur. We need a defence force that can protect New Zealand and also contribute to international security. This is why last year we launched our Defence White Paper, setting out the government's expectations for defence over the coming decades and outlining a 15-year modernisation plan worth nearly 20 billion New Zealand dollars. This will ensure that New Zealand Defence Force not only has the skills but the capability it needs to meet our country's rapidly developing security and defence challenges. This is important for the security of New Zealand, its citizens and wider national interests. The White Paper signalled significant new capability investments in 5 critical areas. Firstly, Antarctica and Southern Ocean operations. Secondly, air surveillance, littoral operations, cyber protection and support, and finally, intelligence support. To support this investment, the government has planned annual increases in Defence Force operating and capital budgets, which will maintain defence spending as a percentage of GDP of around 1% out to 2030. These increases are already underway. Budget 2017 included 406 million more in operational funding and 576 million in capital funding over the next 4 years, and the National Party will continue to deliver against this capability plan. The National Party believes it is critical for New Zealand's future that we remain outward-looking and engaged with the world. We are a trading nation. It is what we do, and we're good at it. Despite being a nation of less than 5 million people, we produce enough food to feed 10 times our population. That is why this government has had a consistent and relentless agenda to open up more opportunities for trade with the world. I cannot overstate how important trade is to this country, how closely it is linked to our prosperity and its mitigating effect on geopolitical challenges. Successive New Zealand governments have built a broad network of high-quality free trade agreements. Our first FTA, our CER with Australia, created one of the most seamless cross-border marketplaces in the world. We have secured high-quality agreements across Greater China, including the mainland, Hong Kong, Taiwan, as well as Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia and Korea. These agreements have delivered real results that have always far exceeded our expectations. Our goods now exported to mainland China, is 4 times what they were before the FTA. 6 months into our agreement with South Korea, our wine exports there have increased by 30%. Together with Australia, we've negotiated a trade agreement with the 10 ASEAN nations. We now trade more with those countries in a week than we did in a year in the early 1970s. One of the trade agreements we are working on is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, with 16 countries representing 3 billion people and a total GDP of US 23 trillion. The Asia Pacific is the world's fastest growing region, and it's shifting from an investment-driven growth to consumption that better fits our profile of soft commodity exports. ASEAN nations are expected to consume 3 times more dairy by 2050 than they did 10 years ago. Their meat and fruit intake will double, and beef consumption in China is expected to triple over that period. These are hugely significant opportunities for New Zealand producers, and we need to be ready to help meet these opportunities. And our focus on RCEP is augmented by the extraordinary breadth of potential agreements with the China FTA upgrade, EU FTA, the TPP 11, the UK FTA, PACER Plus and Pacific Alliance. While many countries continue to push for open borders and greater integration, the voices of protectionism have grown both internationally and even within our own parliament. You may have noticed some of our political opponents have become increasingly fearful of the world and more inward-looking. The National Party will always be outward-looking. Where others lack the belief in the ability of New Zealanders to succeed on the world stage, we look to our horizons to see a platform of greater prosperity. Where they seek to impose constraints, we choose to stand behind these people willing to put themselves forward, their capital forward, their ideas and services and their people forward. We know that if we open doors, New Zealanders will walk through them, creating opportunities for themselves and others, but we must not take this for granted. Yes, we are doing well, but we can't be complacent. We need to constantly review our trade strategy and test it for relevance in the context of a global environment that is changing rapidly, and with Trade Agenda 2030, our new trade strategy, that is what we are doing. It will see us work towards more secure and predictable market access with a focus on eliminating tariffs and addressing non-tariff barriers to trade. The latter, non-tariff barriers, are estimated to cost our exporters nearly $6 billion a year in the APEC region. We've set an ambitious target of achieving FTA coverage for 90% of our goods export by 2030, up from 53% today. Those of you experienced in trade in this room will realise just how challenging that target will be, but I'm sure you'll realise the massive potential benefits. If we have broader coverage of free trade agreements, our exporters will have more flexibility to take advantage of opportunities as they arise and better adjust to a downturn in any one market. The 4 key shifts in Trade Agenda 2030 are firstly the drive to achieve 90% of our goods export covered by them, and secondly, as tariffs reduce, greater attention to non-tariff barriers such as subsidies, custom delays and technical barriers that are holding our businesses back. And as someone who's come from a period of time in Fonterra and Zespri, I can assure you that that is an area that I personally have a lot of interest in. 3, increased focus on measures affecting services investment in digital trade. And 4th, an increased focus on helping exporters translate market access opportunities into competitive success. In the budget earlier this year, we support these initiatives by committing another $90 million over the next 4 years, opening 2 more diplomatic posts, strengthening the public service's capacity to negotiate new free trade agreements and build on the existing ones, particularly to tackle non-tariff barriers. We will make it easier for exporters to alert the government to any trade barriers and ensure MFAT and MPI respond quickly and effectively. We will also provide more intensive support to businesses to help them negotiate issues which can be complex. And finally, we want to do a better job of providing more information to the public about trade deals. We will lead on trade, just like we did in instigating the TPP, just as we are in keeping it going as an ambitious option for New Zealand. At the end of the day, in my view, that's obviously the time to wrap it up, Bell. At the end of the day, for me, trade isn't just about containers. In fact, it's not about containers. It's about people and developing deep value relationships, having the right person or knowing the right person at the right place at the right time. The same could be said for security and defence. A strong multilateral system provides the opportunity for small states to contribute to broader conversations. Small states can bring a perspective and a view that can help build and develop responses to some of the world's biggest threats. Under the National Party, New Zealand's approach to security will remain grounded in the conduct of constructive discussions paired with real action underpinned by enabling investment. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Thank you for the introduction, and can I also acknowledge my colleagues. I thought I'd start from a quote, because I've only got 10 minutes, from Brooke Barrington, because he says this so much more concisely than I ever can. He was at Select Committee earlier this year, and he said this is from the transcript of what he said. New Zealand's typically bipartisan approach to foreign policy is something to be prized. New Zealand's foreign policy is built on 4 pillars. First, support for a rules-based international system, which reflects our national values and which delivers all countries the same rights and obligations, regardless of size, location or power. Second, membership in international and regional architecture as a way to reinforce the rules-based system and amplify our influence. Third, a network of strong bilateral relationships underpinned by our reputation for being a fair-minded people, which we can leverage in the pursuit of shared interest. And fourth, the diversification of our trade as a way to underpin our prosperity and insulate New Zealand from the vagaries of the international economy. These 4 pillars, which support the advancement of New Zealand's international interests in both certain and uncertain, have their foundations at home. We derive strength and international resilience from being a cohesive society and an open and successful economy underpinned by robust institutions. I'm sort of tempted to sit down there, really, because I don't think anyone can put it better than Dr. Barrington did then. I think that essentially says that there's actually not a lot of difference in trade, defence, or foreign affairs policy between ourselves and our major opponents, the National Party, but that does not mean there are none. And it's not much point coming to an election forum without highlighting the differences, which is what I will do. The differences historically on defence have included, I think, the Labour Party being a lot more forward thinking and bullish on nuclear-free policy. You'll know that we differed from them, from the National Party there, and by our decision to stay out of the invasion of Iraq, notwithstanding very strong pressure from our traditional allies, including the United States, Australia and Great Britain. Both of these are well known, and I believe history shows us to be on the right side of those controversies. I don't see those differences as undermining this notion that we have strong and settled values that lie behind the bipartisanship which has been maintained, notwithstanding those agreements. And I think it's the broad agreement for that bipartisan approach to foreign affairs which actually sees to its endurance. Although we might scrap around the edges, and at times those disagreements, as with Iraq, are actually very important, nonetheless there's a huge area of stability and agreement within New Zealand, and those principles that Brooke Barrington expressed. He could have delivered that, a very similar speech 10 years ago, and he could deliver a very similar speech 10 years hence. I think those values and those beliefs will endure. I want to highlight two other areas of disagreement. We think ethics are always important, just as we think that we should, as a small country, and often countries, actually mainly a lot of European countries, remind me of the fact that as a small independent nation that's got a reputation for speaking our mind, it's important that we do speak our mind, including on issues relating to human rights, even when it's unpopular to do so, and even when we're being critical of superpowers. Obviously we do that with caution, but we nonetheless should stand up for those values. Ethics are important at home, and you'll be aware that one of the controversies that we've been highly critical of recently was the unprincipled deal rightly criticised by the Auditor General in respect of Saudi sheep, and the somewhat unusual arrangements that were used there in order to assuage Saudi concerns and bring the Gulf Cooperation Council deal into being. It didn't work anyway. The second thing that I would highlight is, and I really do accuse the National Party of breaching the long-term agreement on trade, actually relates to some aspects of your sovereignty that you should not give up as a nation. Todd is right to raise the concern of rising protectionism around the world. And any government who is blind to societal concerns about some aspects of globalisation or technological change, you really do have to listen to your people. And one area where we think it's wrong, and where we do think we need to protect the interests of New Zealanders against the interests of richer 1%ers from overseas, is in the area of land ownership. When the Chinese Free Trade Agreement was signed, I was one of the cabinet ministers who raised the issue as to whether we were protecting our right in that agreement to change the areas of investment in land that we screen for or prohibit. We delayed cabinet committee approval to that agreement for a week while we checked it out. Sure enough, officials had done a good job, and that agreement protected the right of a future New Zealand government to ban buyers of New Zealand residences from mainland China. Similarly, the Chinese government reserved the right to ban New Zealand purchases of their homes. And indeed, since the signing of that agreement, China has done that in respect of some New Zealand purchases in their large cities. And they're right to do that. They should have the sovereign right to do that. Sadly, in the South Korean Free Trade Agreement, the government breached this rule, and we gave them a slap about it. We said, we'll vote for the agreement, but we want to try and fix that. And we pointed out it was a completely unnecessary thing for them to trade away, given that the prior year, Australia had a free trade agreement with South Korea, and Australia retained the right to ban buyers of their homes from South Korea. And indeed, in New Zealand's agreement with South Korea, the South Koreans have retained the right to ban New Zealand buyers of their homes, but the New Zealand government gave up their right of a future government to introduce that ban. Now, that has flow-on effects unless it's fixed into the Chinese Free Trade Agreement because of the most favoured nation clause that is found in virtually every agreement. They continued this mistake with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and that is the main reason why we objected to it. And that level of bipartisanship has to be respected if you want to have enduring agreements around that sort of thing. So we continue to be critical of the fact that even on the TPP 11, there is no attempt made to fix that yet. Now, it is plain, I know the government says that this is going to sail through without any change to the agreement from any country. Rubbish. It will not. There will be changes advanced by different countries, and that change should be advanced by New Zealand. And if we are elected, we will be advancing that change in respect of TPP, because we think in this world with rapidly concentrating wealth, there are some things that you should protect in your home country, and one of those is we think that houses should be sold according to the means of New Zealanders, marketed in a New Zealand market, not an international global market. So, investment protocols are important in trade agreements. I think I've threshed that one long enough. I covered human rights. Defence is not going to change much under either government. We inherit their budget lines. We're not proposing to change them. Same percentage of GDP will be spent on defence, and it hasn't actually largely changed since National took office from us. It was pretty consistent through that. I want to talk about exports. I think this target of 90% coverage of 90% of exports by free to trade agreements is tomfoolery. Sure, we should be seeking more free trade agreements, but you could drop your exports and still meet the target. It's a nonsense. Why have they given up on the prior target of lifting exports as a percentage of the economy? They had an ambition to lift exports from 30 to 40% of GDP. They've gone back to 26% of GDP until the end of their forecast period, by which time they would have been in government by about 14 years. They will still be under the 30% of GDP that they started with. Now that underperformance is caused by misallocation of capital, and trade policy can't fix that. That's because we spend far too much money trading houses in Auckland to each other at far ever higher prices and not spending enough on investing in the new enterprises that grow competitive advantage through developing new products and services that we can take to the world. So if you want to grow exports as a percentage of your economy, you've actually got to get those economic settings right. Free trade agreements are important, but they don't control as directly capital allocation. I think I'm probably just about out of time. The only other thing I would say is that you really can't have a debate about any matter relating to either security or economics or fairness in the world without talking about climate change. It is a disgrace that so many years after emissions pricing was introduced, half of our emissions that come from the agricultural sector are still not exposed to the marginal price of an increase in emissions. That is how you drive change in behaviour that helps New Zealand do its share to actually reduce the climate changing emissions that are going to cause 30 million people to have to move in Bangladesh if sea levels rise by a metre. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui, kia koutou. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to fill in at short notice for Dr. Kennedy Graham, who couldn't be here for reasons that many of you may well know. It is with great respect that I thank Kennedy for this opportunity. My own involvement in this area sort of stretches back a long time, from all sorts of international negotiations on the Earth Summit in 1992 and the UN summits following that, involvement in arms trade, particularly small arms and cluster munitions, involvement in climate change negotiations, including Copenhagen and Paris and a few of them in between, and WTO and trade negotiations from Seattle to Hong Kong. So I've while I haven't been our global affairs spokesperson, I come with a certain hardwired experience on some of these issues. I wanted to pick up on the theme of kind of where we agree and where we don't, what's cross-party and what isn't. And to deal with kind of three areas. One is threats to peace and security. Second is around a core of foreign policy and aid, and to finish up with trade. Actually, I think our points of difference probably go in that order. So firstly, on threats to peace and security, just a couple of highlights. I mean, we I think, are largely in agreement across parties. I'm particularly looking forward to New Zealand's signature, hopefully on the 20th September, on the Nuclear Weapons Convention, and all respect to the Vice Chair of the negotiations, Del Higgy, for the fantastic job that she has done and New Zealand has done in pushing these negotiations forward. We, I think, would benefit from a no withdrawal clause in the agreement, but even so, we're strongly supportive of the convention, and we hope the government doesn't have a rethink on it. On defence, on the peace and security issues with regard to the Pacific, I think we have some concerns about some things happening in the Pacific. We're very concerned that the Pacific doesn't become a theatre of competition between China and the United States. A militarized and a theatre of competition in the Pacific, I think, does us all no good at all. And I think there are ominous clouds on the horizon where we need to be very vigilant about what is happening and the alignment of different Pacific countries. It's a complex and changing position when Fiji and Papua New Guinea in particular have a look north policy. Other Polynesian countries are seen to be very much in the orbit of Australia and New Zealand. So I think we often look at the Pacific and imagine that everything will continue as it is. In fact, I see some strains emerging, and I think that we need diplomacy in the Pacific and a respect for Pacific nations that perhaps we haven't exhibited in the past. A third area is on the role of the New Zealand Defence Forces overseas, particularly in Afghanistan. We're very keen to see the integrity of our defence forces maintained. There have been allegations by John Stevenson and Nikki Hager in their book, Hit and Run, about human rights abuses, and we think they should be thoroughly investigated. It's the kind of thing that I think the integrity of our defence forces operating overseas is too important not to properly investigate allegations such as those when they're made with a considerable amount of evidence behind them. And finally, I would say that I think we're all on board around the reform of the United Nations Security Council, and actually I pay tribute to former Foreign Minister Murray McCully for the work that he did on reform of Security Council. Unfortunately, we're not there yet, but certainly having New Zealand as a force for reform, I think, is a very positive move. I think we're a little less together on some aspects of what could be termed an ethical foreign policy. And for me, an ethical foreign policy, and part of my career is being close to Robin Cook in the UK at a time that he coined the phrase, the ethical foreign policy. And I think at that time it was quite groundbreaking. I think what we've seen our foreign policy recently is being subsumed by asking for free trade agreements. And I would like to see New Zealand being a force for ethics in our foreign policy. That to me means keeping up the pressure for human rights and keeping up the pressure for action on climate change. And particularly given the fact that our focus is very much on the Pacific, sort of partly from my Oxfam background, I would like to see some reform of the way we go about our overseas development program. In particular, we do need to increase the proportion of aid as a percent of GDP, which is falling to around 0.26%, which is way below the OECD average, and going in the wrong direction towards the UN target of 0.7% of GDP. There's not enough focus on poverty reduction. It's all about economic growth, and we would say that it's economic growth in the formal sector, whereas most people in poverty in the Pacific exist in the informal sector. So we would much rather see the aid program reshaped. And finally, more emphasis on living up to our international obligations on refugees and supporting humanitarianism. Finally, to just dip into the issue of trade, many of you may know the Greens were highly critical of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We still are. We don't think that the current agreement is good, and the reason why is not because we don't want to reduce tariffs. Of course we do. We want New Zealand exports to have a chance of going to other countries. But if you look at what trade agreements are these days, actually they're about a whole lot of other things as well. They're about copyright and patents. They're about restrictions on government's right to regulate. They're about health. They're about education. They're about water supply. And they allow foreign corporations to take our government to an international tribunal over measures that might adversely affect their profits. This is a long way away from what we've typically regarded as trade negotiations. So we have concerns not about the need for other countries to reduce tariffs on our agricultural exports, but about all of the other stuff that gets put into trade agreements under a kind of Trojan horse coverage. We see the strategy of having more and more free trade agreements, producing more and more of a spaghetti bowl of different standards and rules across different countries, and they won't deal with one of the core issues for New Zealand exporters, which is agricultural subsidies. In order to deal with agricultural subsidies, you have to go to the WTO. And the more you have these free trade agreements, the less pressure there is for the major trading nations to go back to the WTO and agree on fair rules on the global trade system. So New Zealand's interests are not served, I believe, by a plethora of these free trade agreements, and we are calling for reform of trade agreements along 4 lines. Firstly, on the issue of fairness and equity in the outcomes of trade agreements, and one of the areas that we do find is that, if anything, advantages are being given often to foreign companies over domestic investors, and we are concerned that the pendulum has swung too far, so that large foreign companies, for example, have no rules requiring them to pay tax internationally, whereas the trade agreements are regulating governments on how they can regulate business. So actually we need an international system that is a better balance across the rights and responsibilities of foreign investors. And at the moment, all of the emphasis is on rights for foreign investors without the responsibilities. A second area is obviously sustainability and respect for climate change. If you look at agreements like the TPPA, 5,400 pages of the TPPA, it didn't mention climate change once. In today's era, that is reckless and dangerous. A third area is human rights. That in many areas there are international norms on human rights that are possibly undermined by trade agreements. And finally, on democracy and transparency, we don't think it's acceptable that government should negotiate these agreements without divulging the text of what they are negotiating. In other fora, you have periodic negotiations. The text is revealed, as are the proposals of different countries into those negotiations. I'm looking forward to questions on these issues, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have a wonderful opportunity here to compare and contrast the three platforms and presentations on security, defense, and trade. Thank you to all our speakers for being candid and open about areas of agreement and disagreement, and this is an opportunity for us to elaborate further. So the protocol for questions and answers would be that we have 35 minutes or so before we start losing some of our speakers who have other engagements. So the rules of this house are basically that the question goes to the panel, not to a particular speaker, and so that's about allowing all of speakers opportunity of equal time and fairness in responding to the question. So who wants to go first? And we have a couple of people helping here. So please, Alison, and then John, and then Will. You are messy, you go last. So
Thanks very much. I'm Alison Duncan from the Australian High Commission, and I'd like to ask a question about trade. So both Australia and New Zealand have very similar sort of, I think, trade policies, and it's, you know, tariff reduction is very important to both our countries, particularly on the agricultural side, and of course the point is taken about agricultural subsidies as well. But I think one of the things that both of our countries have found over the years is that you get tariffs down and then behind the border barriers just go up immediately. And so what we face with our exporters is this very real sort of dilemma of we can go to the WTO, we can get FTAs, but then we're still not getting the trade. We're still not getting our products into these other countries because we're facing NTBs and behind the border barriers. And so, you know, that's the reason that so many of these next generation FTAs are including other issues that, you know, can be seen to reduce our sovereignty, but that's what trade is. You know, if you're going to trade with someone, you've got to give up a bit of your sovereignty in order to get access to their market and give access to your own. But for countries like Australia and New Zealand, who have pretty open and transparent and fair legal systems, we wouldn't necessarily expect to bear the same burden of giving away that sovereignty for behind the border type measures. So I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of the comments that have been made about trade, how you get access to these foreign markets if you're not willing to give up a little bit of sovereignty in order to start addressing those behind the border barriers. Thanks.
thank you. All right. So all three of you have an opportunity. So
Okay. I'll start. Thanks very much for the question. I think there's a couple of points to make. I mean, we would have a much better discussion around non-tariff barriers if we were clearer about what's a non-tariff measure versus a non-tariff barrier. Now, you would have heard about this estimate from NZIER, about $6 billion that could be saved from the removal of non-tariff measures from Asia Pacific. They're not non-tariff barriers, they're non-tariff measures. So what's a non-tariff measure? Well, biosecurity is a non-tariff measure. Many environmental regulations are a non-tariff measure. Animal welfare standards. I mean, countries regulate their food system and what happens behind their borders, often for very good reasons. And the difficulty is when you get people who have a point to prove about trade, trying to remove valid non-tariff measures, then you're going to get people upset about that. And you know, I think that the debate needs to actually be about what are true non-tariff barriers in ways that allow countries also to have democratically determined barriers. So, for example, India wanted to kickstart its solar production, solar cell production, in order to meet its Paris commitments, right? So the US said, no, you're unfairly subsidizing your local producers against imports. They're absolutely right. But actually, if India is going to meet its Paris commitments, then actually it needed to support its infant industries in order to develop a viable. So you're going to have those judgment calls all the time, because what's a non-tariff barrier to one is legitimate regulation to another. So if you look at ISDS, cases and investor-state dispute settlement cases that are removing some of these non-tariff barriers, 2/3 of them are about environmental issues. So let's be clear about what it is we're removing. If it really is removing a protectionist non-tariff barrier, then I don't think you'd find too much of an argument. But where you get into trouble is when you find these trade agreements like TPPA that actually have a deregulatory effect on legitimate regulation as well as non-tariff barriers. And you know, I would remind you that more than half of the New Zealand public opposed the TPPA. This was not a fringe agreement. And, you know, so I won't go any further, but actually I just think we need to have a rational discussion about this because it too often gets ideological.
Thank you. David or Todd? Yeah.
Yeah, apple blight. That's right. It's a swear word, isn't it? Any international agreement includes some level of loss of sovereignty. It's, you know, we are agreeing to cede some level of sovereignty with every agreement, whether it's an environmental agreement or a trade agreement or a human rights agreement. So, I agree with that point. There are some things that go too far. I think we have to be careful about investment protocols, as I've said, around things that I think you do have to have regard to what are changing circumstances in the world. And there ain't no doubt that Piketty has proven, and I see The Economist's got another thing out on the web today about this, you know, huge concentration of wealth amongst the fraction of 1%. And to the extent that investment protocols allow outcomes within a country to be influenced by that, then I think it is proper for a country to want to guard their sovereign right to not letting that sort of infection get any worse than it already is in our own country. In respect of non-tariff barriers, yeah, I agree, you've got to guard against non-tariff barriers, and I agree that that's one of the things that is really important and at large in future trade agreements that New Zealand or Australia negotiates with other countries. ISDS clauses, yeah, we've got the not a bad ISDS clause in our agreement with China. We don't think we need ISDS clauses with countries that respect property rights and have good systems of law that are free from corruption. And so we've reached the position that in respect of agreements with first world countries where we trust judicial systems, that we don't need ISDS clauses. And interestingly, no New Zealand companies ever used an ISDS clause. The only sort of international claims that have been brought have actually been through WTO processes country to country. We don't say no to all ISDS clauses. We would prefer them. We don't have a blanket we don't say never, but we express a preference in most agreements now not to have them. And that I don't think will make them, trade agreements that aren't worth having, because we didn't seem to need those things in the past. And there has always been that strange sort of tension between giving a multinational from overseas a right to sue the New Zealand government when a local company would not have that right, which is a sort of a logical thing that most people find a bit hard to grapple with. I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but I've probably rattled on long enough.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for the question. Look, I take issue a little bit with what you've said, Barry. This happens quite regularly between the two of us. We get on well, but I just have a different view. I think the NTBs are very real. Non-tariff measures, I think they're pretty well established, quite frankly, in terms of what they are. I think, NTBs are a huge barrier for exporters in this country, and I'm very pleased in the budget that we're going to resource up MPI and MFAT, particularly behind borders, to be able to strengthen our ability to identify these with exporting companies, large and small, and then actually work a program to try and undo it. This stuff's quite challenging and complex because, from my experience, certainly in the context of Fonterra and prior to that, Zespri, you actually need people in market who've got the technical skills to be able to have the equivalent conversations in market, and they need to be in market for a period of time. And one of the challenges, this is a personal view rather than a national party view, is that we constantly churn our top people around the world. and that's a tradition going back successive governments, and part of the sort of MFAT model is that you're in market for 3 years and then you're in country for 3 years and you get pulled back. And so often my experience is that when you're actually in market and you've got some real challenging technical barriers to trade, you're dealing on the other side with people who've been in that position, building their technical capability around a specific specialised view of trade access that may be going back 5, 10, 15 years. And I often find that we are that we're underdone actually in terms of the numbers of people on the ground and some of the technical conversations that we have to open our products and services up. So I think it's really good that we're signalling that this is a key priority in terms of investing in people and putting them up in market. And it is by far, to me, the greater challenge. I mean, you know, we can have a conversation around whether 90% of goods traded as a target is, you know, pie in the sky or appropriately ambitious, and I'm going to be on the appropriately ambitious side of that. But the actual reality is that the chunky, hard part of opening up markets is actually getting an ease of our export access, particularly removing those procedural obstacles, the technical barriers to trade, and the non-tariff measures. And that's what's going to take real resources to be able to roll back. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd.
My name's John McCormick. I'm chairman of the Hawke's Bay Friends of Israel Association. And for the benefit of the MPs present, my first branch patron was Deputy Speaker Jeff Braybrook back in the day. The first offer of New Zealand troops to serve in the Middle East was back in the 1890s, when the then governor offered the British government 1,200 men to fight in Afghanistan, 1/4 of which would be Maori. That offer was not taken up. The first time we fought in the Middle East was, of course, Gallipoli. And since then, we've fought in Palestine, World War I, the Sinai, in Egypt. I have an uncle with an Egypt Star medal. World War II, we were there. At the time of El Alamein, we were in Homs in Syria and had to rush down to El Alamein and fight there. Since then, we've been involved in peacekeeping operations there with the UN TSO since 1954, and other units in other parts of the Middle East, including on the Iran-Iraq border when we had Andover aircraft there. Our main operation in the Middle East is the Sinai Peace Force, which of course is a non-UN force, because the Security Council refused to allow a UN peacekeeping force to be set up after the Camp David peace accords. We've also been involved in policing the Indian Ocean there for pirates and what have you, and security in the Gulf. None of you talked about the Middle East at all in your speeches, and we have big trade deals there. We have security requirements there. And I'd like your comments on that part of the world.
Thank you, John.
An incredibly sad part of the world that I think just about everyone in this world, that in this room, would agree is tormented and no end in sight. Actually, that's how I would summarise that. In respect of Israel, I was personally greatly offended that Mr. Netanyahu said that New Zealand's sponsorship of the resolution just before last Christmas was an act of war. I thought that was ridiculous. I was proud that the New Zealand government sponsored that, and disappointed that subsequently they seem to have walked away from it a little, notwithstanding the fact that all of our traditional allies in Europe and Australia backed us, and that the Americans abstained. I think that as a small independent voice in the world, we've got our right, every much right as everyone else, to actually say when things are going wrong, and I'm proud that we did it then. I was tempted to go over and and say something to what you just did then. You know, I think so many of us can claim linkages to awful things that have happened in that part of the world over the years. I had an uncle killed, you know, well, actually not a great uncle, that branch of my family died out. One died in Gallipoli, and another went mad, and I suspect suicided coming back from the Western Front, having survived Gallipoli. I had a great uncle at the Battle of Beersheba. I had an uncle in North Africa. We've had New Zealanders in the Middle East trying to help for decades. And the idea that the Israelis would see it as an act of war for New Zealand to stand up for those for the rule of law, and to say that those provocative settlements on the West Bank are an impediment to peace, not just in Israel but in the wider Middle East, I think is just wrong.
I'll just make a very brief comment. I agree entirely with David on that. I was proud that New Zealand supported and was co-sponsor of Security Council Resolution 2334, and I just would observe that the history of military interventionism in the Middle East is not one of achieving intended consequences, and I think that as former head of Oxfam, we saw the results of some of those policies, and as always, it's the vulnerable civilians in those societies who bear the brunt of the conflicts and the interventionism. So I guess I'll leave it there.
I did speak about peacekeeping, and I also talked about provocations.
Okay, so
Okay,
it's
Todd, please.
my turn now.
Yep.
Firstly, thank you for the question. I had a great privilege, actually, along with David Parker, last month or so, to go up to Iraq and see our contribution up there, along with the Australians, in terms of training the Iraqi forces to, in this case, deal with the challenges of Mosul. And so my comments are going to be particularly focused on that area. I was hugely struck by the complexity of the issues that exist up there, both on the ground and, of course, all the the myriad of historical challenges that brings it to the fore today. And one of the analogies that we used was sort of like peeling an onion, right? You're there for a week, and you sort of perhaps get an understanding of the first layer, but it just this layer upon layer. But one thing that absolutely stood out and was very clear was the respect in which the New Zealanders were held, and Australians, but in this audience particularly, the New Zealanders were held by the Iraqis. David and I and Minister Mitchell got to meet the Iraqi generals themselves, and through translators heard firsthand around the respect that they hold our troops in, the technical proficiency that is being imparted to their troops. They were about to head off and head back into theatre in Mosul. And the thing that also struck was the humility by which New Zealanders are in their country, and that was a message that came back to me quite strongly. We were very welcome there because of the culture and character that the New Zealand Defence Force has that goes back 100 years, and we've heard from the questioner some examples of that deployment. So that to me was great to hear, and also highlighted a proportional response, in my view, for New Zealand to be involved in that part of the world, taking the best and brightest of our defence forces and putting them in a role of training the Iraqis to be able to manage a very complex and challenging environment over the next few years. Obviously, with respect to the specific Israel question, our support for the resolution is noted, and I'm also delighted and pleased that we have now restored full diplomatic relations with Israel, because, as I said earlier in my comments, and this is now more a personal comment, that it's the person-to-person, people-to-people relationships that I think give us the best chance both to articulate the New Zealand perspective and also through our efforts engage on challenging issues around the world and make a difference.
Thank you to the panel. We have discussed trade, we have discussed Middle East. Will take us further.
William Hovard, Centre for Defence and Security Studies. I guess my question is in follow-up to the previous question. Given the degradation of ISIL and our ongoing commitment to the Middle East through the BPC, where do you see things moving in the future in that particular space?
Thank you, Will.
Well, I mean, obviously we've got our current commitment, and that will be up for an incoming government to reflect on its appropriateness, its fit for purpose, and whether an incoming government sees value in New Zealand and Australia being up there providing support. It probably won't surprise you, sir, that my personal view, I'm hardly going to sit here and commit a future national government to a course of action up in that area. But my personal view was that I was very struck by the impact that we were making. I felt our involvement was proportional, and it was very clear that the need would continue for a period of time. And I guess that's going to be the judgment that any next government is going to have to make around should we stay there and continue to support if you can see a clear demonstrative impact being made in the community. Now, that's my kids ringing, by the way, just to bring me back to reality. But in my view, I absolutely see merit, but that will be for a future Minister of Defence, no doubt, recommending to Cabinet. Sorry, what was that? Does that mean that ISIL is not being as degraded as perhaps? Well, no, certainly from my experience up there, and I'd be interested in David's view on this as well. We're both up there together. Certainly the Iraqi forces, with support from the coalition forces, certainly had ISIL under significant pressure. But and that as they move down the Euphrates Valley, I suspect there'll be they will get to the point where they'll have them largely sort of on the run. But there's not, in any sense to me anyway, is stability, and so the ability for us to assist in ensuring that the Iraqis can add capability into their system and stability into their system, I think is still there. I mean, the risk for sectarian violence to flare up as the common focus on defeating ISIL starts to retreat is very, very real. And so the question there is, what is the role for the Iraqi army to be able to assist in the long, inexorable journey back to confidence in the community and the civil society and their institutions? The army has a significant role in that, in my view, and if we are asked to participate in assisting their training with respect to that into the future, I think that's a very fair question to be asked of us, and one that's going to require deep consideration by a future Minister of Defence and Government.
Thank you.
I won't comment on or pretend to know what's happening with regard to ISIL's degradation or otherwise. I do think that armchair experts based a long way away from the Middle East are often looking for evil empires to counter, and I would say that there's often not a sufficient basis of understanding to know how to intervene on whose side and in what way. We would far rather see New Zealand's contribution being in the theatres of humanitarian work, of peacekeeping, and in supporting negotiations, because that's the only way that we see a future for the Middle East, not in endless armed conflict.
I don't think we take much pleasure in the Labour Party in saying "told you so" in respect of the unwise invasion of Saddam Hussein by coalition forces some time ago. Find it hard to believe that a similar mistake was made not that many years later in Libya. Well, someone said Yemen there. Nonetheless, ISIL has been a barbaric force with extraterritorial ambitions if one believes the media, found now in the Philippines. And those things, I think, are a concern for lots of countries. I don't know what the answer is to these issues. So I won't pretend to give one, but I am vexed by the fact that after so many years and so much money has been spent in Afghanistan, Taliban are now back in charge of 40% of the land area. And although, and again, this is not a Labour Party view, but you do wonder how long that'll continue, how long other countries will continue spending billions of dollars every year there. And abhorrent though their treatment of women is, they don't seem to have an extraterritorial ambition now, and I wonder whether in the next decade we're going to see countries say, well, some of these countries are going to have to be at one level fending for themselves. I really don't know what the answer is. The easiest part of the answer, of course, is for New Zealand as a small country distant from these theatres. It's actually we're a bit player.
Thank you, Ambassador. I know there are several ambassadors, but
you don't want to speak, do you? Yeah. Rob Saagman, ambassador of the Netherlands in New Zealand and in 5 Pacific Island states, and that includes Fiji, which was mentioned, I think, by Barry Coates. And I want to pick up on one remark that you made, your concern about the rivalry between China and the United States and the militarization of the Pacific. And the question to all three of you, what does this mean for New Zealand's foreign policy in the area? And connected to that, I would like your opinion about the growing presence of China, more in the economic and financial sense, on the islands, all kinds of loans, which are not as soft as they seem, and that provides influence, perhaps not necessarily made use of now, but could be tomorrow. You see an influx of Chinese immigrants slowly pushing out, for example, in Tonga, local businessmen. This must pose a challenge to New Zealand foreign policy in the area as well. So I'd like to hear your assessment and your conclusions with regard to New Zealand policy. Thank you.
Yeah. I think, again, these are very complex issues, and certainly in my previous role at Oxfam, we saw a lot of that Chinese influence going into the Pacific, and I think not always in ways that were entirely benign. Equally well, I think we see some areas where Chinese investment and trade has been very welcomed. So very complex. In terms of New Zealand's own role, I think we've gone through an era where New Zealand has rather taken the Pacific for granted as being in our backyard, therefore we deal with them in a rather patronising way. And I think the time has come for that to change. I think we need to show much more respect to our Pacific neighbours. And I am particularly concerned about the latest trade agreement, the PACER Plus agreement, which has been signed by some Pacific countries and not others. I think one of the greatest strengths we have in terms of maintaining Pacific peace and security is by having a strong regional presence and a strong regional voice for the Pacific itself. And the idea of having a trade agreement that cuts across the Pacific, separates most of the Melanesian countries from the Polynesian countries, I think is not healthy in terms of regionalism in the Pacific. It undermines the Pacific's own agreement amongst themselves. And I think it reinforces a view that Australia and New Zealand have negotiated a trade agreement that is primarily centred on New Zealand and Australia's interests rather than the Pacific's interests. So we would see that actually as being a backward step, and I think we need to be thinking very carefully about what role we play in the Pacific, given our strong cultural and historic ties with the Pacific, to look at ways that we can re-engage, particularly with the Melanesian nations, to play a very positive role with regard to Melanesian nations. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I apologise? I've got to leave after this because I've got to catch a plane for an event that I've got first thing in the morning in Auckland. Thank you for that question. I think the first thing I would want to acknowledge is that China is a rising superpower, and I can understand why they see this transition as them occupying their rightful higher profile part in the world. And I think that's an economic reality, and that other superpowers before them have wanted to assert themselves as well. And I think that is a reality that we should acknowledge and welcome. I also believe that most countries in the world, in their engagement in the Pacific, they actually do want better outcomes for the Pacific, and so we've got to find points of alignment that turn this into a positive experience. And I suspect some of the things that have happened in respect of some of those loans and are things that no one wants to see repeated, including the companies that received them, countries that received them, and I would hope some of the donor countries would think that there's better ways of doing that too. I think that Australia and New Zealand are improving their cooperation in their attempts to exercise to help Pacific countries manage their resources better and to bring forward good governance and push against poor governance and corruption. That's positive as well. And I would also express the hope that, notwithstanding the unusual things that are happening out of the United States, that the United States doesn't become too isolationist and withdraw, because I think that would be bad too.
And similarly, I'm going to have to leave after this, but very good question. And in many ways, for me, it's Brooke Barrington's comments that my friend and colleague David Parker referenced as a perfect framework to be able to use to respond to the question. Firstly, with respect to the importance of support of a rules-based system. Clearly, when you look at be it United States or China and them seeking to project influence anywhere in the world, and particularly in this part of the world, we are always going to hope and push for and be a strong advocate for any challenges or points of tension to be able to be managed through a rules-based system. Secondly, with respect to Brooke Barrington's second point, was the importance of membership of regional architecture, and I think the Pacific Island Forum in particular is a useful forum, very useful forum, and we play an influential role there. I'd like to take issue with Barry Coates' view around the fact that New Zealand are patronising, to use his words, in the South Pacific. I reject that utterly. I was at the South Pacific Economic Ministers Forum, stepping in for Minister McCulley a few months ago. To a minister, they were hugely connected to the efforts Murray McCulley has, in particular as the former foreign minister, the way he, in their view, had prioritised the South Pacific and worked heavily, particularly in the areas of fishery as an example, to be able, and with Shane Jones, obviously, as the ambassador of Pacific Affairs, to assist to actually bring real commercial frameworks and opportunities into an area that has huge potential but has never really been invested in with the right sort of focus and discipline, certainly at a regional level, and he's led that, and I think he deserves credit for it, not the opposite. And finally, of course, the points that Brooke made was the importance of bilateral relationships underpinned by trade. And in my view, the PACER Plus is a great example of that. Again, Barry and I, as second or third time we've disagreed on that point in the last couple of
Funny
weeks. I know. But I actually see it as a mechanism that is very useful for both underpinning trade and development. And I think it will be a very appropriate vehicle to assist the countries of the South Pacific with New Zealand's support and Australia's support to be able to grow and strengthen their economic performance. So I might stop there as my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, time is up, so we will, two of our speakers have to leave. So perhaps if you can, Barry, you can stay a few more minutes. We have one definite question coming from here. But let me, on your behalf, thank our wonderful panel. I was watching the audience, and I have to say, every time you said you agree on things, the audience was very pleased. And every time you said you disagree, the audience, same people, were also pleased. So I think it's a wonderful win-win opportunity for us to, feel good about areas of agreement, but also be somewhat a little bit confused and challenged by areas where we have a nuanced perspective. So thank you very much. And as someone who works in education, that this is a wonderful outcome for us. Hopefully we will continue these conversations. Maybe next year we'll have an opportunity with the 52nd Parliament to organize a similar discussion. And the center, our center, is also going to host the second National Security Conference in April of 2018 with support from DPMC. So we will let you know, but we will continue this dialogue. So with that, thank you very much to the panel. Please join me in that.